special episode of The Complete History of Science. Today I'm talking to Professor Michael Carroll on the history of reproductive science. This is obviously a different format to our usual episodes, but with the very long production cycles, I thought some interviews might make a nice stopgap. The episode was originally supposed to come out a few weeks ago, but as someone decided to start a war and I'm living in the Gulf, it's been a bit delayed. Anyway, I hope you enjoy. Hello, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us today. I thought we'd start by just you giving a little bit of background of yourself and your work, what you specialize in, and also a little bit about how you became interested in the history of science.
Lovely. Thank you for inviting me. It's great. I'm a big fan of your podcast. I'm originally from Ireland, from Tipperary, a small town called Templemore, and I studied toxicology in Athlone before moving to the UK to do an undergraduate in biomedical science. And after that, I went to Newcastle University and did a PhD. And the PhD was in reproductive science. It was looking at how sperm and egg communicate with each other in an intracellular level with calcium and calcium waves, etc. Soon after that, then, after my training there, I was appointed as a lecturer in reproductive science at Manchester Metropolitan University. And I've been here since 2011 now. I'm an associate professor in reproductive science, and most of my remit is to deliver and run a program on clinical science or in embryology and andrology. My interest, I continue doing some, research on male reproduction, male fertility, but I've branched out a little bit into the history of science. In particular, my interest in Leonardo da Vinci and his approach to anatomy and reproductive anatomy, and I've published recently on that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I'm interested in all sorts of stuff, and history of science, and reproduction is one of them as well. Yeah.
So was it Leonardo was kind of your gateway into it, would you say?
I've always been interested in history. And when you combine history and science, and there's people involved in science and their notions of the time and how their notions stick to previous notions, they adhere to kind of rigidly, and then how they can break away from that over time because they're discovering new things and developing science, and doing experiments and better observations. For about 20 years, I've been interested in the history of science, the history of the people involved, and what they were thinking of the time. Mm-hmm. Leonardo was a more recent interest because I saw some of his drawings in 2019, and I thought it was very a beautiful drawing. But he was an excellent anatomist as well. And he did a lot of very beautiful and very accurate anatomical drawings. And I thought, well, what has he done on reproduction? So bringing my expertise in reproduction, love of science, love of Leonardo, I put that together and did a bit of a study on him.
Yeah. Leonardo is an interesting one. He's certainly somebody I could have touched on probably a few times in the podcast and kind of left out for, I think, mainly in the interests of time. But he's kind of interesting as a kind of observer. I would kind of say maybe with someone without the kind of theoretical background around it, although I know you've written a little bit about it and we'll touch on it later, but he's kind of quite influenced by Galen, is that right?
Very much so, yeah. He used to say he wrote in new notes, he's not a man of letters, so he didn't speak Latin or Greek. So right. A lot of his reading would come from his Italian translations from Avincia, his work. And that would be the Galenic theories of physiology and anatomy.
Yeah.
He went against it a little bit. He discovered some new things himself, but he mostly stuck to the notions of the Hippocratic Galenic notions of physiology and stuff.
That's really interesting, the fact that he didn't speak Latin. I suppose my bias is a lot of the people that I read, like they've always had a good education, and part of a good education at that time was learning Latin, also later learning Greek. So it's very interesting that, of course, there were other paths of education, and Leonardo was more of, I guess, they thought of painters as craftsmen rather than, intellectuals like we might today.
He was illegitimate, so he wasn't permitted to go to a formal school. He had the basic arithmetic and English language kind of, but not any formal education. So he couldn't go into university, for instance, or train as a notary like his father. So he was limited, and that's what's kind of stuck with him from life.
That is very interesting. So we might circle back around to Leonardo. I didn't mean to get into him so soon. I thought we would start a little bit with another publication of yours, which was The Road to 1978. Could you tell us just a little bit about the significance of that year, what happened in 1978?
1978 was the birth of the first IVF baby, Louise Brown. And it wasn't just the birth of the first IVF baby, it was the birth of a branch of medicine, assisted reproductive technology. And since then, there's been 12 million babies born through IVF across the globe. In some countries, it can be up to maybe 4 to 10% of the birth rates or the babies born in a country through IVF. So it has a significant impact on reproductive health and, of course, for rectifying infertility issues for both males and females.
Yeah. So how did our do you see it as a culmination of kind of the science of reproduction? Like, what were the things that at least immediately, just before, kind of led into discovering, or not, maybe discovering is the wrong word, but, being able to do IVF?
One of the challenges was getting sperm and eggs, human sperm and eggs together in a culture media, in a solution that will function physiologically, that the sperm would recognize and bind to the egg and fertilize that egg, and then you get the early embryo development. That was the big bottleneck of that technology. And it wasn't only until 1870s that it was established that actually sperm are involved in reproduction, that sperm fuse with an egg. It was Hermann Fall discovered this in sea urchins or one of the echinoderms. The sperm fuse with an egg, and that creates the embryo. Yeah. Before that, they didn't really know the role of sperm or egg. But once they've understood that in mammals, they started to do some in vitro studies looking at rabbits and mice and other animals. And then it wasn't until the 1960s when they realized that the sperm needs to be in the reproductive tract of the females, of the woman or the female mammal, but to undergo a chemical change called capacitation. And once that's done, they can fertilize an egg. So an freshly ejaculated sperm or sperm that's extracted from the testes doesn't have the capacity to fertilize. They have to reside within the female reproductive tract for a period of time. And that was a challenge as well. So that was discovered in the 1950s. MC Chang and others discovered that. And then that led to Robert Edwards and Steptoe to be able to, and Barry Bavister, the people in the early IVF world or embryology world, to develop techniques and cultural systems to apply this to humans. And they did that for a number of years. They started in the 60s, in the early 60s, early to mid-late 60s. And they published a paper, I think it was in Nature in 1968, where they showed the first fertilization. And it took a long time, like 10 years after that, to have the first IVF baby. There's a lot of challenges.
Yeah, it's a wonderful achievement, isn't it? Like you say, there's 12 million IVF babies. So it's helped millions of people to, have children. It's a fantastic achievement, and possibly one that's maybe not as widely appreciated or celebrated as maybe it should be.
There's still a taboo around IVF. There's still that little bit of, it's something that people don't speak about. Infertility is a condition that people don't really speak about much. It's still on the edge of.
I guess there's also a religious element to it as well. What's the position on, say, I don't know, the Catholic Church on IVF now?
I think they're okay with it now. What the arrogance is the onanism or the masturbation.
Right.
They're still not keen on that. Okay. But I think they're turning a blind eye and allowing it to continue.
Yeah, okay. Maybe the less said about that, possibly. So I wanted to bring the discussion round then and kind of build up to later science. And I thought we'd go right back to the beginning. And I wanted to go right back to very early ideas of reproduction. So say before antiquity, before the Greeks. What were very early ideas of production? Like, my assumption is people have basically been always aware that sex has led to pregnancy. I mean, is that true? Are there mystical kind of religious ideas around that? What are the very early ideas that you're aware of?
We have limited evidence of any of this because it's the pre-literate era, like the Upper Paleolithic. But we can assume things are based on the carvings and whatever bit of artifacts that are left behind. One of them is the various Venae or Venuses that we see around, particularly around Europe, around 30,000 years ago. And I have a model of the Venus of Willendorf. This is one of them here, for those who can see this. It's a small kind of obese woman, if you like, with no features on her face, but she has features of a breast, vulva, and other parts. So she's quite rotund. It is believed that that was representative of an appreciation of fecundity or fertility, in that if you're at a time of plenty and you can store some adiposity or body fat, you're in a good position to give birth and raise that child because there's plenty of food and resources around. So that's what they think it might be. That's why you have the breast and genitals exposed and highlighted, not the facial features. And there's quite a few of them around Europe around that time. This was discovered in 1909 in Willendorf near us in Australia, or Austria. So they had some ideas. I mean, if you think about it, from intercourse to childbirth is 9 months.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things can happen then. You know, a season can pass by and you wouldn't know what's going on. So I don't think they really connected it straight away. There would have been some mystical kind of associations with that, but they did associate. You know, once there's a copulation, there's ejaculation, or there's something within that fluid that may have some mystical property. And that would eventually, and then when they started observing animals and when agriculture started to come in, they started breeding animals. They would know that if you're breeding various sheep or other hoofed animals or even dogs, that the gestation period is shorter. Therefore, there was that more of a clear connection between mating and live births.
So it's difficult to talk about pre-literate societies. I think in the podcast, possibly the first episode has some information about pre-literate societies, and that's basically it. Most of the time I've started with antiquity, I've started with the kind of Socratic philosophers, that sort of thing. Just in terms of that, so those very early ideas, like from the Greeks or from the Egyptians or from the Babylonians, those pre-Aristotelian ideas, do you know much about that?
The Egyptians did have a better understanding of reproduction, and they knew about poultry and poultry breeding, and they know the difference between a fertilized and an unfertilized egg by holding it up to lamps or light so they could see the developing embryos. They also understood potentially some causes of infertility. They had this way of testing for pregnancy by urinating on a wheat germ or something like this, which would indicate to them that the person who had that urine was pregnant or something. So, and they had fertility gods as well, but again, mystical. Not really down to physiology, but more down to the mystical religious philosophies of their time.
There's a sort of element there, isn't there, where we it's quite relatable, where people who are having difficulties conceiving, you can imagine very easily at the time they would have turned to mystical or religious ideas in the hope that they could conceive. So there's something very, very relatable there, I think, and something that also kind of links back to IVF later. And actually, we've kind of overcome that to some extent. That's interesting.
Fertility symbols and fertility gods, they're in every culture.
Yeah.
So it was a very important thing to follow and believe, because you needed that generation, that fecundity. And if you didn't, it can affect that individual in their status within the community and in the tribe. Yeah. So it's very important, and it still is today.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, let's move on to Aristotle, and I think we have to touch on Aristotle because certainly what I've realized, kind of doing the podcast, is every road seems to lead back to Aristotle, and there's very little that he didn't touch on. So maybe give a little bit about his idea of human reproduction, and possibly a little bit about his influence as well afterwards.
Yeah, Aristotle, he is interested. He had his hands on everything, he had his brain on everything. He was very interested, and he did write quite extensively on generation. That's what it was called then. It wasn't until the mid-1700s that generation became what's known as reproduction. But he was influenced from probably a little bit by Hippocrates. And Hippocrates had the idea of the various humours. The phlegm, blood, black bile, and yellow bile. Yeah. And that balance of those would give rise to ill health or good health, but also fecundity as well, fertility. And one of those fluids, the vital fluids, was semen. And in his writings, Hippocrates' writings, he called it sperm. So he said that you had the female sperm and you had the male sperm or the semen, and a combination of those will give you the offspring. child. And it depends on the heat of the sperm. Hot semen gives rise to a boy. The weaker, colder sperm gives rise to women or girls.
Right.
Aristotle took that a little step kind of further. Well, he took his own take on this, and he emphasized that it wasn't so much the two seed process, it was the one seed basically. And he favored the male. That patriarchal view of reproduction carried for millennia.
Yeah.
And he said that basically the females are a receptacle, and that the males produce the semen. So when the semen reaches the uterus, it triggers the development of what he called catima, which was this kind of a gel of, I wouldn't say preformed embryos, but he developed the hypothesis or the theory of epigenesis, so that it was a mass of something that needed a triggering of the man's semen to trigger that development, and then the embryo would develop and the child would develop from the menstrual and uterine fluids that were already within the woman, and women became a receptacle basically. You are like the soil in a pot, and the male seed would be planted, and then that pot would kind of generate the offspring from there.
Yeah. So it's obviously going to be a very simplistic idea in terms of, so there's like the idea, he must have understood that certain traits were passed down from the parents, like, hair color, eye color, etc. There must have been some understanding of that, right? Did he imagine that all of that came from the father?
I think what he really said was more of the balance of that. So anything that was a weak character, a weak trait would have been probably from the female side, and the energy and vigor would be from the male side. And because the heat and
right.
He used to say if you wanted boys, have sex during the heat of the summer. And it was very much that energy surrounding.
So that's related to the Hippocratic idea as well, like and I can well imagine that those sort of kind of ideas also must have had a kind of root in kind of mystical ideas, because I think those kind of old wives' tales still persist, don't they? In terms of if you want to have a boy, it needs to be kept warm, or I don't know the details, but that sort of idea still persists, right?
Yeah, probably does. I mean, Aristotle's views persisted for 2,000 years nearly, and it influenced the church and their views on reproduction as well. The Thomas Aquinas' acceptance of Aristotelian philosophy.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about the sexism inherent in it as well. And although I've not written much, or I don't know much about reproduction per se, I have written a little bit about anatomy and reproductive anatomy. Is it fair to say that Aristotle characterized the kind of the female reproductive system as kind of a copy of the males, but kind of lesser in some way?
Yeah, he kind of saw it as kind of an inverted male.
Yeah.
So he recognized homology between males and females. He recognized, and particularly he didn't do any human dissections, but he did a lot of observations of other animals. He probably did some dissections of other animals as well. And he did a lot of studies on chick development as well. So you had that. That's where his epigenesis kind of theory comes from the egg, or from the uterus or whatever, that the embryo forms and develops from that. So again, Galen is another one who took Aristotle's views even further and mixed it with Hippocrates, and he saw that the inner workings or the inner parts of the female reproductive system, they're inside because they need to be kept there because it's too cold. It's kind of keeping some sort of balance of warmth, whereas the male's reproductive side parts are outside, like the testes, because they get too hot, so you need to kind of balance and cool them down a bit. Yeah. So he saw it like that kind of difference between them.
Is it fair to say there's an element of truth to that? I mean, maybe it was, he happened to only chance upon it, but there's a truth to that, isn't there? That the testes are outside because they need to be cooler. Is that true?
Yeah, the testes, spermatogenesis, the production of sperm in mammals in particular, it occurs around 34 degrees, 35 degrees, which is just below core body temperature. So that's why you have external testes in the scrotum of a lot of mammals. Some mammals don't have external testes, like elephants and seals and dolphins and whatnot. But they will shuttle the blood around to cool the testes internally to kind of keep that temperature difference. So you're right. I think as well, when you look at Aristotle was a great observer. He studied lots of things, and he was a keen observer, and he took notes on that. And if you look at tortoises and turtles, they're very temperature sensitive in terms of how the males and females are formed. So when they bury their eggs, depending on where they are, the depth of them in the sand or the soil, or the temperature that these eggs are exposed to, you'll have males or females. So it was probably from his observations of these things that happen in nature that would have influenced his thought. It wouldn't have been something he would have plucked out of the air, I'm sure.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Like, we don't really understand the degree to which Aristotle or Galen actually were able to dissect and actually were able to observe these things directly. So we know that there was a taboo on dissection at this time. We don't really know, though, these men of, science who are keen to observe everything, keen to kind of understand everything, to what extent they actually went along with that.
He did a lot of dissections, I think, and Galen did lots of dissections. Galen was the Greco-Roman surgeon and anatomist.
Yeah.
And the physician to Marcus Aurelius, which I found out recently, which is a claim to fame. Again, Galen's work lasted a long time as well. His notions lasted a long time, but he was a little bit more meticulous, I think, than Aristotle. Yeah. He did lots of he looked at the physiology as a connecting kind of system rather than separate entities, if you like. Another thing that was interesting, what Aristotle, what he said was when a man gets an erection, it's down to the weights of the testes, and the cord of the testes, which is the spermatocord, is like a pulley system. So if a man is bigger, the testes become engorged, they'll pull the penis down and then that rises up. And his evidence for that was that if you have a eunuch, if you cut the penis off young boys, as they did in those days, they won't become aroused, they won't have an erection because they don't have the weight of the testes to pull those cords to get the erection up there. So he was thinking of lots of things, not just about the formation of embryos.
So going into the Christian Middle Ages, these ideas persisted, I think, mainly through Galen. Is that fair?
Yeah, Galen's notions continued for many hundreds of years, centuries, after the rediscovery of those works from the Arab scholars. And the Arab scholars took it a little bit further. So they looked at, they rediscovered a lot of the Greek work, the Hippocrates and Aristotle and a few others and Galen. And they repackaged it in a way that they could do extensions of studies on that, like optics and lots of physics and stuff as well. But biology as well. And Avicenna, I'm probably pronouncing can't pronounce his name wrong.
I don't know.
Avicenna was one of the Arab scholars who was a physician and anatomist of his day as well.
Oh, sorry, did you mean Ibn Sina?
Ibn Sina, that's the one.
That's the way I would say it, yeah. Sorry, God.
So he took that a bit further. And then when his work that influenced the Renaissance anatomists and the ones following that, and they followed his work to a T, really, because he spoke to the word of Galen via who spoke the word of Aristotle. And then the church had a massive influence there as well, because if you went against Aristotle, it was considered heresy. Galileo got slapped for doing that.
Yeah. So I'm about to get heavily into the research on Galileo soon. So I'm kind of interested in the kind of church's influence. So you have that kind of middle period where the kind of scholastics dominated, and they were definitely heavily influenced by at least some aspects of antique thought. Did they have anything to say on reproduction that you know of, like in that sort of medieval university setting?
I'm not too sure. I still think they followed Galen. There was very few human dissections as well. So I think Mondeo, who was an Italian anatomist and surgeon in the 12th century, he did some dissections, and he was one of the first to do a kind of a manual of how to do dissection. Yeah. And that influenced the subsequent scholars and anatomists to be able to carry out this work as well.
Yeah, so that's certainly the case. So in that later medieval period, the kind of taboo on human dissection was kind of lifted for the first time. And that's how we get men like Leonardo and Vesalius and, a lot of other figures kind of were able to start dissecting for the first time afterwards, because that taboo was lifted. So yeah, we've kind of come back a little bit round to Leonardo. So to what extent did he perform dissections? Like, how did he observe? Because he obviously wasn't medically trained. And one of the things that I've really learned is, if you don't have that medical background, you can be the greatest observer in the world, but it's very difficult to kind of make sense of the human body, which is this mass of flesh and blood and muscle and everything else. So how did he observe? Like, he did dissections, presumably, did he?
When he was in Verrocchio's workshop, that's where he did his apprenticeship to become a painter, an artist, and sculptor. They would have done some dissections at some level there, even if it was only a limb, because what they wanted to see was the structure of the muscle and how that imprinted on the skin. So if you wanted realistic paintings or drawings, it's best to do it from the objects that you're representing. So he would have been exposed to some cadavers or some parts of cadavers during his time there. And that triggered his interest in anatomy. He loved, what we love Leonardo is very pieced between his massive notes that are all over the place, and it's just a mess of his note writing and stuff. But you can try to piece it together. So his interest in anatomy was initiated by he used his anatomy to inform his painting practice and to be a better painter. And it became then the other way around, where his art actually became the tool for his study of anatomy, because he had a brilliant replicate and a way of sketching, and he had a great way of sketching from memory as well. So if you think about it, in 16th century Florence, there were no ways of preserving cadavers. Yeah, and if you had a cadaver that was flayed open, you've got a very limited time that you can do some detailed sketches before you can't stand the smell anymore. And he says it in his notes that it's the sights that you see are you really have to have the bravery to stand and do these studies, especially in the dark of the night while their dead corpses are staring at you when you're cutting them up. So he became very interested in anatomy, and he did a lot of stuff on anatomy, and he became pretty much self-trained in many ways, but he collaborated with a guy called Della Torre in Pavia, I think it was Padua in Italy. And they decided he would put some sort of a book together, anatomy book, and he pulled it all together, put a lot of drawings together, and he said he would do it by 1511, I think, but Marcantonio Della Torre died of the plague in 1510. So that put a stop to his ambitions for study. But no one knew anything about Leonardo's anatomy work until, I think it might have been the 19th century, when they rediscovered his notes. So he was kind of lost to that science. It was Andrea Vesalius who really became the father of anatomy. Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting that there was clearly some sort of practical, kind of pragmatic aspect of studying anatomy if you're a painter in order to improve your painting. But from everything we sort of have learned about Leonardo, it seems like his interest kind of went deeper than that. And actually, maybe that's how it started, but actually he became just obsessed with learning about the details of the world and observing the details of the world, like beyond what was, actually useful. It's probably not that useful to understand the inner female reproductive system to be able to draw even his, nudes and things like that. So it's very, very interesting. He got very engrossed. He got very deeply engrossed in anatomy, and probably one of the things that most of his endeavors were anatomy. He loved it because you can see the details of his drawings are comparable to today's anatomy texts. But he followed Galen, that's the thing. He followed the Galenic notions, and he rarely challenged it. And even the earlier anatomists like Mondeo, they would just pull bits out of the human cadavers and say if Galen was right, and seldom say he was wrong, but they just kind of confirm what they know from Galen's writings.
I think a lot of people had difficulty challenging Galen because it became so fundamental to their thought. And it took someone like Vesalius, who was, incredibly self-confident, incredibly well-educated, from this kind of stock of generations of doctors to the imperial court. And it took someone like him to be able to have the confidence to say, some of these things are wrong. It's very interesting. And then kind of once that happened, the water broke and all of a sudden lots of people could say it. Do you want to move on to the microscope? And how are we saying it? Leeuwenhoek?
I think it's Antoine Leeuwenhoek, but I can go before him because Aristotle's views of the epigenesis and the preformation kind of were the big thing then. So the idea of generation was that sperm or semen, they didn't know it was sperm. They called sperm and semen were equivalent of that time.
Interchangeable,
Interchangeable. So they believed that they followed Aristotle's, I suppose Galen's view of preformation or epigenesis, that the male had a major role in this, and it was just triggering the development of the of whatever was in the female that was already there. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until the Dutch anatomist came on the scene. So you had Niels Stenson, Jan Swammerdam and Reiner de Graaf. And they were all from the same school in Leiden school. And they were excellent anatomists. And they turned their attention to reproduction as well, or generation as it was known at the time. Yeah. They used a lot of dissections. So Niels Steno, he was known as Niels Steno, he became a clergyman at the time. Again, these are polymaths. They're amazing minds that they were involved in everything. He discovered fossils on the sides of mountains and then turned his attention to reproduction or generation. What he noticed when he was doing dissections so he always thought that it was from the sperm, from the male testes. That was where the generative properties came from. The females were receptacle. He said, actually, when you dissect viviparous animals like a dogfish that have the ovaries are full of eggs, they call them the female testes. That they're similar to the male testes, therefore they should have some sort of regenerative property. And then he would dissect sheep and notice that they had kind of the ovaries that kind of would have the similar type of thing. He actually, the first to name ovary was Niels Steno.
Okay.
Swammerdam was studying insect metamorphosis. And what he demonstrated is that insects are derived from eggs that hatch into maggots that develop maggots metamorphosis. And he kind of went against the whole spontaneous generation idea that Aristotle put forward also, which kind of fits in with the preformationism, epigenesis, just things pop out of anywhere. And then he did some stuff with Steno at Reiner de Graaf, where they did some, it was like wax models of the reproductive parts. Reproductive anatomy, and it allowed him more more detailed studies of anatomical structures. They were bringing the female into a more involvement in generation that is not just the males. And they said that it was the egg that was a really important part of it. And then you had some other people who look at egg development. Matt Biggie looked at the egg development or chick development in the egg. So they said things come from eggs. It's preformed. It's in the egg. What the sperm does, or the semen does, is trigger that development. And they became known as the ooths. Everything comes from the egg. Harvey's famous quote is ex ovo homino. It all comes from the egg. Because Harvey took an interest in reproduction of generation as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, so on Harvey, again, I'm very aware that his later work was focused on generation, but just in terms of the podcast, it kind of didn't kind of fit with where I was going. I think what will happen is I'll go back and do a deep dive into generation and reproduction at some stage. So when were these people active? This was around the 16th, 17th century?
Yeah, it was the 1660s, 1670s.
So we're well into the kind of scientific revolution by then.
Yeah.
I know you said they're polymaths, but was their background medical?
A lot of them started out doing medicine. And then they find that medicine can be quite gruesome. So their interest in it was called natural philosophy at the time. So Swammerdam was interested. He described metamorphosis. He was the first to really describe that insects come from a different state into a metamorphic state from larva to adult. And that whole idea of spontaneous generation was debunked by him and a guy called Francesco Redi, an Italian scientist at the time as well.
So they're kind of watching the life cycles, I guess, of these kind of insects and things like that.
Harvey was interested. He said the male has to have a role because he was very much followed Aristotle. And what he would do when he would do dissections of deer, he would want to see evidence of the male involvement. But he couldn't. He could only see maybe the ovaries, but you can't see sperm. The microscope, even though it was invented then, wasn't very good. So he could only see no evidence of the male involvement. So that mystical aura that the sperm would produce or semen would produce to trigger that development was still there. So that's why he was disappointed near the end of his life when he published To Generations. He said, ex ovo hominid, okay, it all comes from the eggs now.
I think that's another interesting point, which is that so many times in the history of science, we do come to these hard blocks, and it doesn't matter how smart or how good of observers they are. They came to this hard block where they couldn't make progress because without the microscope, you just don't know that the sperm exists. So on the microscope, so Leeuwenhoek was not the inventor, but he certainly was the person who pushed like where the microscope was going, and he had a connection to the Royal Society. Is that right?
He did. So Leeuwenhoek was from the city of Delft in Holland, and he was a minor notary there, but he was also he was a tradesman. He was into cloth and stuff. He had a little clothes shop, I think, at the time. But he would grind his own lenses. Now, at that time, another influential person was Robert Hooke. He perfected the microscope. The microscope was invented near the end of the 1500s by the Janssen brothers and Hans Lippershey. And they just put two lenses together in a little tube and they could see things that were magnified. And that was amazing. Galileo actually improved it by putting in a focus wheel so they can move the tube upside down to give you more acuity.
Yeah.
Robert Hooke developed the microscope a step further by adding a condenser. So he would condense the light, focus it down into the specimen so you can see it better. So for microscopy, you need resolution, be able to discern between two tiny objects, and detail, the magnification, and seeing what you're looking at. He improved that. And he published Micrographia, where he demonstrated his wonderful drawings that he did on the microscope. And I think Leeuwenhoek might have had a look at that because it certainly inspired him to have more of an interest. So he would grind these lenses, but unlike Hooke, there were compound microscope consisting of two lenses. Leeuwenhoek's was a single microscope.
Right.
Tiny little single microscope with a tiny lens, a round lens. And for those who can view this, I have a model here. So he would have a specimen kind of point here that we put his specimens on. And then we have a tiny little hole where you can see the lens here.
Yeah.
And some of these magnifications are considered to go up to like 300, 400 times magnification. And that's quite extensive, viewing point.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Microscopy, yeah. He discovered all sorts. So this was like in the 1660s, 1670s.
Yeah.
And, he discovered capillaries. This is before Harvey even got on. And he discovered asexual reproduction in aphids. He discovered protists and these animalcules, he called them. These little swimmy things that he found in water and in bodily fluids. He also discovered spermatozoa or sperm.
Yeah.
So he used his own semen. And he writes in his letters that he did it by conjugal activity, not by any sinful means. So
was that protecting himself from a kind of religious?
So he got the semen in a capillary tube and would place it just by the lens, and then he would see these swimmy things. And he thought they were little worms, little animals that lived in the testes. He didn't know the real function. But he left it to one side. He says, all right, I won't tell anyone that because, he doesn't want to expose himself to that. But then a friend of his, who was a professor at the university, a colleague of his, said, I have a young student called Ham who wants to speak to you about something. And he goes, all right. So Ham comes along and says, I have a friend who has got the clap. Back then, gonorrhea was rife.
Right.
And he said, when I looked, because they had microscopes were available then, you could buy them in shops. He said, when I looked down a microscope, I can see little things moving about there. Can you have a look and confirm it? Because I heard you're doing lots of stuff on this. Leeuwenhoek was known at the time for his observations and his discoveries. So Leeuwenhoek admitted that actually I've seen them in my own semen. They're normal. That assured Ham and his friend that there was no issues there, that it wasn't. So he probably did have the clap, but it wasn't a sperm that was causing it.
That's interesting. It does seem like he basically observed everything, didn't he? He was like very keen to see everything that he could see.
You imagine?
The microscope.
Could you imagine that time? So it was around the time that Galileo was pointing his lenses up to the skies and discovering that Copernicus was right and pushing against the church at the time. And then Louise and Hooke and others are looking down into the tiny parts of the universe. That was a time of really exciting discoveries. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, that's exactly how I feel about it, and that's why I'm kind of so excited with the kind of research that I'm doing, because it is a really exciting time. It's also a very complex time in terms of there are so many things going on and they're overlapping. And, if we go back a few hundred years, there's big gaps between people of significance. There's hundreds of years, aren't there, between Galen and Aristotle, and there's, hundreds of years again till we get to people in the Middle Ages and Leonardo and people like that. And everything seems to be happening all very suddenly. And you're right, you've got things on the big scale, but you've also got things on the little scale. It's a really exciting time. And I've got quite a romantic kind of idea about it. And it's certainly one of the things that got me into the history of science.
Every activity was a discovery. Every peering down that microscope was a new discovery. You don't have that in science anymore. You might discover a pathway, or you might discover something that you haven't seen before and publish that. But back then, everything would have been a Nature paper. It was amazing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just on the sperm, so you'll have to forgive my ignorance again. Roughly how big is a sperm? You said the magnification was 300 or 400 times, did you?
That's what they've measured and predicted that it might have been. There's very few of these microscopes available or in existence. They've all got lost or somehow. Yeah, the sperm is the smallest cell that a human body produces.
Right.
It's apportioned into different parts. You've got a head, a midpiece, and its tail, or the flagellum. The head is about 5 microns. So it's 10 to the minus 6, is it? Meters.
Yes.
And then it has a midpiece in the tail. So in the total length of it is about maybe 70 microns. But if you were to look at it as a little dot, it will be 5 microns. So they're tiny little things, but they move about. They're very wiggly. They move about, and you can see them. I did see them in a capillary tube myself when I was doing some research, looking at sperm and trying to with follicular fluid. You can see them, but we used a pretty good microscope to see them. But for Louise Hooke, he wouldn't have discerned much. But from that, he took samples from dogs, from cockerels, from horse, and of course humans, and he saw some similarities in rabbits, and he saw some similarities between them. They all have head, midpiece, and tail. And I'd say he drew them. He didn't draw them. He wasn't very good at drawing. He used to hire someone to do the sketches. Matthew Cobb has published an amazing book on this called the Sperm and Egg Race, and he describes Louise Hooke's attempts at trying to describe to the artist what he's seen down his little microscope, where he caused all sorts of rows. It would have been, again, it would have been a great time to be around.
Yeah, I don't know the details of it yet, but I've always wondered that about Hooke's micrographia as well, and to what extent. I don't know, did he do much of the drawing? I think I'm going to have to research it myself.
Hooke was amazing. He was a true polymath, and he's often regarded as London's Leonardo.
Yeah.
And I tell my students this, if you haven't heard of Hooke, you're going to hear him about him now. And he's one of these unsung heroes, and partly that's due to Isaac Newton's dislike of him and challenging him for various reasons. But Hooke was a brilliant artist as well. It's what he wanted to do as well. He loved art as well. So he did all this drawings of the sketches of the observations that he made, which included the first description of a cell. So he did a section of, I think it was cork. He did a very thin section, which probably is the first tissue section as well in the world. He did a section of cork, looked it down his microscope, and he noticed that the cork was full of these little spaces that resembled the little houses or the huts that monks used to live on, called cells. So he called them cells. So he said that these tissues are made up of these little things called cells, and that's where the word cell comes from.
Yeah. So yeah, he's an interesting character in terms of he's somewhere between the quote sort of technician and the craftsman and the scientist. I'm really interested in that as a theme.
He was, yes.
So we talked about the sperm being discovered. Could you tell me when the egg was discovered then? I'm guessing that was later?
Yeah, so the egg, the mammal egg, the mammalian egg was discovered much later. So if you go back to the 1600s, in Holland at the time, so the Reiner de Graaf, he looked at the human ovary and he found a structure in the human ovary that he said that's the human egg. So he was kind of followed the ovist preformationist theory. So he was the followers of these, that everything comes from the egg, so he's supporting Harvey, etc. But what he discovered, what we know now is called the Graafian follicle, which is a mature oocyte, but it's a follicle that the egg is in, and it's fluid-filled kind of sac that's found in the ovary. It wasn't really the egg, but did have the egg in there. And he didn't realise that at the time. But he's accredited for discovered that, and he gets the name the Graafian follicle after that. But it wasn't until Carroll von Baer, he discovered a mammalian egg, and he did so by dissecting his pet dog that died. So he was very saddened by his spaniel that died. But like anyone who loves science, if there's a bit of something you just cut it up and look into it. I did that when I had budgies. They used to die, and I used to say, well, I'm interested in what's going on here. So I used to dissect the budgies and see how their respiratory system differs to mammals. Fascinating things. But he discovered the mammalian egg, and he watched it under his kind of watch glass, and he said it's a speck. He said he fell back on his chair, and he said it was the most wonderful sight he has ever seen, and he had to pinch himself to see he wasn't dreaming. And then he looked at it again, and he said, yes, this is the egg, the human egg that had never been discovered before. And that was around 1827. Quite a long time between.
Quite a long time, yeah.
Yeah, between the Graaf, which is the 1660s. It's nearly 200 years, 150 years after that, where the human egg was discovered.
Was there an element of sexism again to there? So what I'm kind of discovered from my own research on anatomy is there was certainly an element of sexism in the difference between, how they treated male and female anatomy. But there was also an element of pragmatism as well. And so in anatomy, simply there were fewer females looked at because there were fewer female criminals, and the majority of dissections took place on male criminals because those were the ones that were being executed. There was an element of sexism there, certainly, but there was also an element of, well, that was what was available to the scientists of the time. Do you think that the study of the egg, there's an element of sexism, or do you think it...
I think it's more practicalities of it. The testes are easy to get. The ovaries are more difficult. You have to dig in to the body cavity to get them. And like you said, there would have been fewer human cadavers at the time. But there was an interesting fellow that I just discovered recently called Frederick Ruisch, Ruisch. He was an anatomist around the mid to late 1600s, and he was one of the first forensic pathologists. And he said there has to be a role of sperm in this. This is when the ovist, everything comes from an egg, a notion was dominating. And he says, well, there has to be a role, because he was called upon to do a dissection of a woman who had recently been murdered. And she was a prostitute, and she had just had sex. So what he noticed when he went into the uterus, that when he's pushed down on the cervix, he called it the sperm was released. This fluid came out, this cloudy fluid. That was the semen, he said. And then when he dissected another woman who was killed by her husband, who again for adultery, but he gets in there, straight in there, and started doing the dissections. They said again, there is the male element in here, so it has to be the male semen or sperm is more involved than just a mystical kind of triggering force. It has a physiological active role to play in this. And he was doing this around the 1670s, and that's where Spallanzini comes in. In his work, Lazzaro Spallanzani, where he started to look at a generation at time as well, and he says yes, sperm and egg must have a role. And he did some interesting experiments using frogs,
Mm-hmm.
So when frogs mate, the male will grab onto the female and it into this kind of a copulation kind of hug, if you like. And she will spawn her eggs, and then he will milk the eggs from his semen to release his semen. What he did was he got the eggs from a female, put them into a little jar, and then covered the jar with a lid, and then added the semen from the male on top of that. And he noticed that none of the eggs were fertilized or developed into any tadpoles. But there was a little kind of film of kind of dew that he called it the aurora sperma. It was like there was something that the semen gives off that would that he trapped in that layer.
Yeah.
He then did another ingenious experiment where he got the male frogs, and he peeled them off the females and made little taffeta breeches. So he put them on the males and then put them back onto the female. So when she spawned, they would release their semen, but they'd release it into these little breeches.
Yeah.
None of the eggs fertilized, but when he removed the semen from these little taffeta breeches, he fertilized the eggs. So he said, yes, the semen is definitely involved in generation.
Yeah.
It was called reproduction then by that time. That was around the 1770s.
Is that breaking away from a preformationist kind of theory then, a kind of Aristotelian theory? Can you explain a little bit why? Because I'm not sure I 100% understand. So Aristotle's kind of saying it triggers the process in some way, right?
Yes, epigenesis. He says that it's there in a kind of a mass called the catama.
Yeah.
The sperm triggers that development. So without the sperm, it would just be that mass. That undeveloped mass. And then over time, and that's where epigenetics comes from, this unfolding, if you like. Then in the 17th century, when they started to look more at the eggs and the viviparous animals, it became the oocyte, or the pre-formation that it's all in the eggs, because they studied chickens, and they thought that, when you fertilize a chicken egg, you can see the development of the embryo in the egg, and they related that to mammals and humans. Yeah. So the sperm would just, again, it was very male dominant. The sperm or the semen had a mystical triggering effect, activating effect that would trigger the development of the preformed embryo. It just grows rather than develops. So that was the preformaceous theory. Yeah. And then the everything comes from an egg was based on, you just trigger that formation of what previously exists in the egg. And then with the discovery of sperm, Louise thought that actually it's the sperm that became the spermist, that the sperm implant into the uterus like a seed in a potted soil and then grows. And it became known as the homunculus. Like each sperm has a little man in there. And when that man is implanted into the uterus, that little man grows. But the church didn't like that because millions of men die daily, and they didn't like that waste of life. So that wasn't a very popular notion.
So you kind of, I guess for a long time then, you have these theories side by side. So you've got the preformationist camp still exists, right? It still persists. What would you call the other camp?
Well, the epigenesis camp, which is very Aristotelian, kind of faded away a little bit. They were very much following either the spermist, everything comes from the sperm, or the oocyte, everything comes from the egg.
Right.
They never really connected the two, that you get the sperm and the egg. But Spallanzini, he said you need semen and egg, and they need to be in contact. It's not just a mysterious aura that it gives off. It has to be in contact with the eggs. Now, this is at a time when Spallanzini was a good microscopist as well. Yeah. But he never associated sperm with fertilization. He thought to it just little wiggly things, parasites. Yeah. But it was the aura, but it was the aura of the sperm, of the semen, that activated the eggs. So still you have the elements of Aristotle, that kind of aura, mystical type stuff, without real function.
Yeah, okay. I kind of see a little bit better now. So it had, basically he was saying there has to be some physical contact between them. Something has to actually go together. So, okay. We're kind of possibly skipping quite a bit of time here, but what were the things that led up to, I believe you said it's the 19th century that we actually see the egg being fertilized for the first time by the sperm?
Yeah, it was. It was Hermann Full and Hartsucker. These are two embryologists. They were students of Ernst Haeckel, and they worked on marine animals. And they were the fathers, really, of embryology. They looked at early embryo development in sea animals that you can easily access, and you can see their development with microscopes. Now, by the 19th century, microscopes were better, much better.
Yeah.
The compound microscopes were better. The magnification was better. The lighting sources were better. That they were better engineers, and even companies like Zeiss were developing better lenses, objective lenses and ocular lenses for scientists to work on. So they had a lot of better equipment. So Hermann Voll and Hartsucker, they were interested in the fertilization mystery. Those sperm, those little swimmy things, bind to an egg, and are they equally involved in this whole reproduction thing? And they discovered it. They saw Hermann Voll and Hartsucker. They actually saw a sperm fusing with an egg, and that egg developing into an embryo.
Right.
And they drew it. They drew it out, and you can. I have a kind of I saw a copy of it in Villefranche-sur-Mer when I was doing my postdoc in the library there, and it was amazing to see. Following, you can see the sperm. He's drawn of the sperm binding to the egg, and then you can see the nucleus of the sperm moving into the cytoplasmic egg to bind with the female nucleus, pronucleus. And then you have fertilization, and then you have the development of the embryo.
Yeah.
Without a doubt, this was the 1870s. Without a doubt, they said, you need sperm and egg. That's how that's how reproduction happens. There's nothing mystical about it. It's not some aurora with the semen.
Yeah.
It's two cells come together. Now, this happened around the same time you had cell theory. Schwann's cell theory and germ theory, all of this started to coincide that everything comes from cells, and they understood that tissue is made up of cells, and organisms are made up of cells. So it makes sense. It fit with the notion that was becoming popular at the time of the new field of cell biology was being established.
Yeah, so that's all happening around the same time.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Do you have any idea about how they actually observed that? How did they actually do it? I presume that they manufactured that in a lab somehow?
They would have done. So they use echinoderms. So they use the starfish and sea urchins. Now, these animals will spawn their eggs and sperm into the surroundings. So what you can do, and I've done this in my own research, I used a similar type of model to look at when I was doing my PhD. You can get these eggs and you can get the sperm from the animals, and you can fertilize them in vitro. So you can put them in a dish and look down a microscope and see that whole interaction.
Yeah. Okay.
Because they're externally fertilizing animals.
Yeah. Okay. So that's just a misunderstanding on my part.
Yeah.
For some reason, I assumed it was in humans. But that makes a lot of sense.
This was the animals. It wasn't until the 1930s that Gregory Pincus started to do in vitro studies using mammals and then figuring that out with mammals.
Yeah. So I guess it's a very interesting time. So in terms of the genetic aspect, I think we're moving into the 20th century now. Like, was there already the idea, if we talk about Mendel, we're talking about like 19th century, was there already the idea that sperm and egg must carry genetic information? Like, when did that idea arise?
Yeah, it was. It was Beaupre. Beaupre was another wonderful scientist who discovered the process of meiosis. So he noticed that the eggs and the sperm, in particular the eggs, had half the number of chromosomes that a somatic cell would have. And he said there must be something going on there. He used the gametes and eggs of a worm, a round worm called Ascarius, which are these worms that affect horses. So they have big eggs. So you can do lots of experiments on them. So he says, yes, this was now pushing a little bit later down. So sperm and egg fusion, fertilization was established. That was published and pretty much undisputed. But then what's their role in genetics? So Mendel has done his work. I think it was the mid-1800s or thereabouts.
Yeah.
Beaupre was touching maybe a bit later. The late 1800s, 1890 something.
Yeah.
So he said, yes, you need the sperm and the egg come together. And then because they have half the chromosomes, this is even before they knew about genes, but they had an idea that maybe there's some elements that would combine. Yeah. And that the sperm and egg, when they come together, that makes the whole organism. They'll have the full complement of chromosomes. So the haploid gametes will form a diploid zygote. Yeah. So that was the turn of the late 19th century, and it started moving in into the early 20th century.
Yeah. I guess that's kind of on the microscopic level, it was kind of observed around then. Prior to that, did they sort of have some idea? Was it quite well established that by that point that there were traits from the two parents that made up, the child?
They had some idea. I mean, Mendel's work on peas was, although he published it in an obscure journal. It wasn't really discovered until the 20th century, where you had this redevelopment of Darwinism, neo-Darwinism, it's called. They knew there were some traits. Even Hippocrates said it, because because when Aristotle went on about the one seed hypothesis, that you only need that the male gives a form, but the female is just a matter, doesn't do much. It's very much benign. Mm-hmm. Hippocrates says, no, the reason children resemble their parents is that it's the different degrees of the hot and cold sperm. So if you have hot sperm from the man that is more than the cold sperm or semen from the woman, you will have a boy. Right. And the degree of that will determine the characteristics and traits of that child born from that. So they had a very holistic view of hereditary, knowing that it came from some type of reproductive process, but not really knowing that the details of it. Like Hippocrates, it was the temperature of the semen from the males and females. Yeah.
So this idea has kind of gone right through, and then I guess in the 20th century, it's kind of come to, like fruition, and we kind of understand now that genes are being passed on from the parents. Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. So I think we're coming towards the end, but I'd like to again return back to IVF as well. So, like we said earlier, IVF is in some ways the culmination of a lot of this being able to reproduce this process in a lab.
The barriers obviously would be that mammals are internal fertilizing animals. So when the studies on the sea animals like the sea urchin and echinoderms and starfish that Herman Fall and Hartsworth studied, that was fairly easy. You can manipulate. Mammals are different. You need to extract the sperm from the testes or from the semen that will be derived from the male, and you need to extract the eggs from the female's ovaries as well. And that itself was a big challenge. Yeah. Now you need to have them in an environment that's suitable for their health and function, which is very hard to replicate physiological requirements. So you need this culture media, and that was a big challenge.
Right.
Gregory Pincus in the 1930s, he started this with some rodents and rabbits, and he published in 1934 thereabouts first paper demonstrating that you can fertilize rabbit eggs in vitro. And this led to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. It was kind of the science feeding into the science fiction and the old Frankenstein. He was vilified for his work, actually, Gregory Pincus, because they thought he was doing Frankensteinian type stuff.
Right. Okay.
Now it was pioneering work. It really showed that you can now, just like with these sea animals, you can fertilize these mammalian eggs in vitro and give rise to embryos. Yeah. It was challenged because you have what's known as parthenogenetic activation of parthenotes. Right. Parthenotes means that they're artificially or they're activated without sperm. So you can get early embryo development. The cells will divide, which looks like normal development. Yeah. It wasn't through the sperm. It's probably through a change in the membrane structure or just a change of ionic concentration across the membrane. And that happens with a lot of things. You can do it with frog eggs. You can inject a frog egg, or stick a frog egg with a needle, and you'll trigger that activation. Yeah. But Gregory Pincus' work was challenged, and it says, well, you didn't demonstrate real fertilization and early embryogenesis because rabbit eggs in particular are easily activated parthenogenetically. So it wasn't until the 1950s that a guy called M.C. Chang developed special culture material, and he got the eggs from one breed of rabbit and the sperm from another breed of rabbit. Right. They got the sperm and egg from a breed of rabbit and fertilized those eggs in vitro, and then put those embryos back into another breed of rabbit. Yeah. And that like an Angora rabbit. And that Angora rabbit gave birth to the parent breed of rabbits, like a black rabbit. Yeah. So he showed that you can transfer the embryos that we've cultured in vitro and put them back in. So he demonstrated that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I was going to ask that. So like this IVF process, it was done in animals first. It sort of reminds me of cloning, where for whatever reason we're happy with it to happen in animals, whereas we're a bit more sometimes uncomfortable with it in humans. And I suppose it also makes sense because you want to test these things on animals before they happen in humans. I'm guessing there were still some steps that needed to take place before we went from animals to humans.
Yeah, I mean the big challenge was again, how do sperm? Because you remember earlier when I said the sperm needs to reside in the female reproductive tract to undergo the process called capacitation. It was Chang and a guy called Charles Bunny.
Right.
He did the experiments and demonstrated that you need a particular type of concentrations of various components in the media to trigger this capacitation. And you can do this outside if you make this media. So he did this in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And that's when Robert Edwards, he was a geneticist or a physiologist in Cambridge at the time, and he was interested in doing this in humans. Yeah. And his dream was to, because he had a lot of friends that couldn't have a family, so he was very aware of the issues of infertility, and he wanted to cure that. He wanted to treat that and have a system that he can provide a technology that would give people the families, give them a child, and let them have families. And he took the work from the animal studies that Chang did and a bunch of others did, and transferred it into humans. But he still found it difficult because he couldn't get the sperm to activate the eggs because they weren't capacitated. So it was a guy called Barry Bavister who developed this media called Bavister's media, where he changed it to pH and various components, and the sperm fertilized the eggs. The human eggs. But the issue then was, how do you get human eggs to do these experiments? Very difficult. So they were donated ovaries, or through laparoscopy, they put in kind of needles into the abdomen to extract out the eggs. Again, very difficult. How do you do that? So that's when he partnered up with Steptoe, Patrick Steptoe, in Oldham in Manchester. Steptoe was a great gynecologist, and he was one of these pioneers in laparoscopy, where he was trying to sort out do tubal factor of fertility, fix the fallopian tubes to fix fertility, or try to sort out fertility issues there. So he would when he met with Edwards, Edwards says, can you get me some egg material? And because I've got this idea that we can, the animal stuff that's being done now, we can translate that to humans and maybe not cure IVF, but treat IVF and give people a chance to have a child through the sciences that's being developed. And Steptoe was all over it. He says, yes, no problem. But the first thing that Edwards wanted was not to get the eggs or ovarian tissue, was to get the sperm from the oviduct, because he didn't understand, he didn't have the solution, the culture media initiative. And once that was sorted out, once they understood the culture media and you can have the sperm at fertilizing capacity in that media, you needed eggs. And that's where Steptoe come in. And then it was like 10 years of collaborations of driving up and down from Cambridge to Manchester with volunteers and doing all the work. And there's a Netflix movie on it, which is it's called Joy. It's called Joy.
Joy,
and it shows the journey of Robert Edwards and Steptoe and Jane Purdy, the nurse who helped them out. And there's the three people of what they did to develop this field of assisted reproduction and the harrowing steps they had to take, and the science, the failures of science, and pretty much what it's like, and the trials and tribulations of science. But it comes from decades and centuries of trying to understand reproduction. And you have between Louise Hook's discovery of sperm and Hermann Full's looking at observations of sperm fusing with an egg, that's nearly 200 years, 150 years. That's a long time.
It's incredible. And it's one of those things that is kind of like really shows the sort of control like that science has given us over nature, and the way that we're, the masters of nature in many ways, thanks to science, thanks to hundreds of years of developments in understanding. So I'm definitely going to check out that movie. That sounds very interesting. So did they win the Nobel Prize?
They didn't. I think one of the big problems they had, they met a lot of resistance, of course, with the church and ethics and everything else. They met a lot of resistance. Edwards was very, he had an attitude of not resistance, but he fought back. And in academia, sometimes when you challenge someone in power, you lose some research funding. And that was a step back in some of his work. It was Jean Purdy. She died at the age of 35, I think, in the 1980s. She had ovarian cancer, or she died anyway. I don't know which cancer she had. Patrick Steptoe died, around the 80s, I think, as well. And it was only Edwards that survived of that team. But he founded the first IVF clinic in the world, which is in Cornwall in Cambridge.
Yeah.
And then it was eventually in 2010, the Nobel Committee awarded Edwards the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine for the development of assisted reproductive technology.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's
he got recognition.
That is a long gap, but it is I guess it's probably quite standard for the Nobel. So I don't really have much else to ask. I'm kind of quite curious about Louise Brown as the first IVF baby. She went on to become a doctor. Is that right?
She didn't. She lives in, as far as I know, she lives in Bristol. She what she has done is a great advocate of IVF. So if you go to any these big conferences, IVF conferences, she's there. Like, she has a celebrity mode. She has written a book on her experiences of being the first IVF baby. She was very friendly with Robert Edwards. They had a good relationship over the years. She has her own children now. She's very jolly, very affable woman. I met her in passing once at one of the conferences. She's always around. She's a great advocate she's one of 12 million, the first of 12 million.
She's a great she's just kind of a miracle of modern science. Okay, I mean, I've had a fantastic time talking to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you for having me.